Box Asylum listeners, we're with Brin-Jonathan Butler today, a former amateur boxer, freelance journalist and documentary filmmaker who's had his work published by the classical sports website and Saloon.com, focusing on US political and current affairs, and is currently working on a documentary called Split Decision, following the Guillermo Rigondeaux's defection from Cuba, and it also follows the current situation of American and Cuban relations on the economic situation since Fidel Castro came to power in 1959. Now, this also goes through the eyes of some of the greatest Cuban fighters. And Bryn, some people maybe don't know this, but you've actually trained in some of the boxing gyms in Cuba, and you were worked under the tutelage of a two-time world and Olympic gold medalist. How did that come about?
It's just the nature of, I think, communism in Cuba is that doctors, lawyers, any profession, you're not going to be making more than $20 a month, including some of these former Olympic champions who are relegated to training kids or working with the national team in some capacity. And I found out that Hector Vinent, who won a gold medal in the 92 and 96 games, was available. And I wasn't sure what kind of price he wanted under the table in order to train. And it worked out that he just asked for $6 a day, which was about 2 weeks' salary. So yeah, it was very surreal.
That's unbelievable. I mean, I think Hector was actually a part of the squad that I think it was about eight gold medals they won in 1992 in Barcelona. Yeah,
I mean, I think that was the highlight of, since the revolution. I think that was the best team that they ever put forward, was that 92 team. They were just incredible.
It's unbelievable. I mean, I remember reading something about the government, if you were on, if you were with the Olympic squad, you got a government subsidised lifestyle, how much is it, a government subsidised lifestyle? Is it a house you get? Is it a car? Do they get so much money per month?
Well, I think it depends on who you are. I mean, if you think about the most famous Cuban, really after Fidel, I think it would be a boxer with Teofilo Stevenson, and he was given the house that was actually next door to Che Guevara's widow. So it was a pretty decent house by Cuban standards, but it was hardly the mansion that I had heard it was. In the Miami Herald, you hear that the reason why all the fighters stay is that they're given this, they're living like kings. That's just entirely not true. I would say they live better than the average Cuban. There's no question of that. But after that house that he was given next door to Che's widow and the widow's children, he was moved to a nicer neighborhood called Nautico, where he had the only pool in that neighborhood. But again, it was a 3-bedroom house, and living in luxury by Cuban standards meant that he was allowed to live in that house with just his own family rather than extended family, which is sort of more the typical lifestyle of average Cubans.
Yeah, I mean, I think Stevenson had something like 302 amateur wins with, I think it was just 11 years without a loss. What was, I think you were the last person to interview Teofilo Stevenson before he died. Am I right in saying that?
Yes.
What reason did he actually give you for staying in Cuba? Obviously, I mean, I think he was offered $5 million to fight Muhammad Ali around about 1977, I believe.
Yeah, that's correct.
Was he true to the cause of communism or the socialist state in Cuba?
I mean, I think that's complicated in the sense of, yes, I do believe that. I mean, in his words, I think he put it very eloquently when I interviewed him, that there are certain decisions that we all have to make with our hearts and our souls that we can never betray. And he said, I lived with the decision that I made, and I'll die with that decision. And he did. But at the same time, he was only willing to sit down with me on camera to talk about all the money he turned down, provided I pay him $130 under the table, because he was so destitute at that time in his life. So, reconciling those two seeming contradictions, I think, is what makes Cuba so interesting.
Yeah,
and that was the same way when I interviewed Felix Sabone. Sabone probably turned down $100 million career, something like Lennox Lewis's career, and he, on camera, just endlessly spoke about how money was meaningless. And of course, it's very true that he turned down all that money. But again, he wouldn't talk unless I would pay him $100 to sit down with him, and he certainly wasn't giving that money over to the government.
Yeah, I mean, were you convinced with Tiflo's comments, about what's $1 million compared to the love of 8 million Cubans? Were you convinced of that saying?
Well, I don't know what he would have to do to demonstrate. I don't know what he's done to contradict it. He had every opportunity to leave. There are many other athletes who were in a position to turn down, a lot more money was on the table for them to leave. And even if they did, like the Cuban baseball player Orlando El Duque Hernandez, even when he won the World Series with the Yankees after defecting, he said, I never would have left. I had every opportunity, because he left at about 33 years of age. He never left in his prime. 99% of all the athletes don't leave. And really the ones who do have only left because they're past their prime in Cuba. So I don't see any evidence that Stevenson didn't believe what he said. And I didn't see that he was brainwashed by it either. I just think he was somebody who saw the way his parents lived pre-Fidel Castro and really believed that he'd been given a better life and that his daughter would have a better life than he had. Didn't mean that it was a decision he was perfectly content with. I think he would have loved to have had the opportunity to turn professional in many, as a competitor. But I don't see in any way that he was the hypocrite he's been made out to be from a lot of his adversaries, or Fidel's adversaries, I should say, in Miami and Florida.
I think it was, as I said, I think it was about 1977 was when the Ali fight was possibly mooted, or when the offer was made to Stevenson for that fight. I know Ali was coming off that brutal war against Joe Frazier, which many people believe was probably the end of his career. I think he fought 6 times up until that offer. Reading some of your comments, on a potential fight, I think you were kind of off the side as, Ali hadn't faced someone, like Stevenson, very fleet-footed, very, very strong right hand. But do you believe that maybe Stevenson could go the 15 rounds with someone so experienced as Ali if that fight were ever to happen? I know it's a very speculative question, but do you think he might have blasted the distance?
Well, I think that's the main reason I really wanted to explore that question and just how Cuban boxers in general would have done with that whole kind of continuum of all the great fighters, because I think when Guillermo Rigondeaux against Donaire stepped into the glare of Radio City Music Hall, I think he was kind of fighting on behalf of the legacy of all Cuban fighters, and he just annihilated the 2012 ESPN Fighter of the Year and made him look like a rank amateur. And all the same criticisms that are levied against Stevenson's chances against Ali were identical to what Guillermo had to endure. And my sense of it was also that Guillermo could have done the exact same performance he did probably 12 years before, after the first gold medal that he won. And there's so many criticisms that the Cubans are racking up these medals when they're grown men fighting kids, but all the great Cuban fighters won their first medal, 19, 20 years old. They were dominant throughout their entire careers as amateurs. So I just don't see any impediment to Stevenson. I mean, I interviewed George Foreman at his house. He has a mansion just inside Houston, and his words and his account of Stevenson was that he was the dominant heavyweight of that era. He saw him as being, had he left, that he was the class of that division. And that's quite a confession for somebody, who was as dominant as Foreman was, and the people that he faced and who he just obliterated. So I think Stevenson, especially at that time, given how Ali was quite vulnerable at that time, I mean, he was just about to lose to Leon Spinks in their first fight. Stevenson was a modern heavyweight in his size. I mean, he was Lennox Lewis sized, and he wasn't using weights or anything. So I think that'd be a very difficult fight for Ali at that time.
Plus, you've got Stevenson, 24 years old, I believe, at that time, so potentially at the peak of his powers.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, this Stevenson was such a menacing heavyweight at that time. Not to say that the fighters he was beating went on to have, brilliant sterling careers, but I just think the tools that he had at that time, I think he'd have a chance against any heavyweight. So skilled, so composed, and that right hand is one of the great right hands in heavyweight history, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, one fighter we're going to get back to will be Guillermo Rigondeaux, but I just want to ask some questions about one fighter that I don't really know too much about. I mean, some of the fights I watch have been on YouTube or been able to get from other sources. Felix Savon, I mean, obviously, great pedigree. I think he had 3 gold medals, but I think politics, stripped him of winning a 4th gold medal, I believe, because I think he was 34 years old. And he wasn't allowed to fight for another gold medal. Was that correct?
Yeah, you're not allowed to fight beyond that age. So he retired after the 2000 medal.
What's he up to nowadays? I mean, obviously you had a chance to speak to him. What's he doing with his life now? Because obviously we haven't heard any much about what's happening with the former greats in Cuba.
Well, his nephew has gone on to become a very dominant heavyweight fighter. I think he was robbed when he was at the London Olympics.
Against Anthony Joshua. I felt Joshua lost that fight, obviously.
Yeah, I don't think he's in Felix's class as a fighter, but I mean, as you say, Felix in his prime. I mean, Felix from 86, I think, was when he won his first amateur championship or junior amateur world championship, all the way to 2000. You could make a pretty strong argument. It's the best amateur record in history in terms of he just trounced guys who went on to have really fruitful professional careers. He knocked out David Tua in, I think, a minute. Several other guys who went on to become very legitimate contenders. Sabone just walked through, just annihilated Shannon Briggs, for example. So where Sabone is at now is he was probably, of all the Cuban fighters that I interviewed, he seemed the most content. Maybe he's the most content boxer I've ever met, in the United States or Europe or Cuba, for that matter. He has a house that is kind of like any suburban home you might find. A few bedrooms. He has a little trophy room, some stereo equipment from the 1970s, and his view was that he was living like a king, that he never dreamed that he would have such material wealth. And as I say, it was kind of the lifestyle that anybody in a lower middle class station of life would expect to enjoy. So I think he seemed very, very content, far more content than Stevenson was with his choices. And he was also pretty adamant that had he left to fight Mike Tyson, that he would have annihilated Tyson and anybody else who was there. And he just said, look at my record if you don't think so.
Is it true that the offer for Mike Tyson was also $5 million for Stevenson? Or was it Stevenson that was offered that money to fight Tyson, or was it Savon?
Stevenson was offered $5 million. King and Arum both offered him $5 million. With Sabone, I've heard estimates between $15 and $25 million for him to have fought Tyson. And Sabone's reply that I thought was funny was that the same promoters who actually came to Cuba to his house to try and lure him away, after Sabone just flatly rejected them, they spoke to his wife, and his wife's response was, "You'll have an easier chance getting Fidel to leave Havana than you will my husband." It was an incredible encounter. I was laughing through the whole thing with his responses because they just seem insane, and yet it's quite interesting that you think it's insane that somebody would just be content to not be a millionaire and live adequately. But he didn't live beyond that.
What about, I think we watched the Erislandy Lara through the World Amateur Championships and the Olympics. Although I've not really seen too much of him, the only time I can really get a chance to see him is when he fights with the World Series of Boxing for the Cuban team. How do you know if that's been well received over in Cuba? I mean, obviously, I think the Americans fought for the first time in Cuba there, for the first time in something like 30 years or something like that, I think it was.
Yeah.
You know, was it? You
Yeah,
know, do you know if it's been well received over there? The world sees about because it's semi-professional boxing, so they'll be getting paid for it. I mean, is that well received by the state, etc.?
Well, the state is in a transition with sort of all walks of life in Cuba. So yeah, they're starting to take some necessary measures with the athletes, I think, to mitigate just this pipeline of Cubans who are defecting, both in baseball and boxing, because certainly, especially since about 2006, there's been more athletes than in history, in the sense of since the Cuban Revolution began, defecting. And there's a much more efficient pipeline of athletes leaving now that the smugglers' boats have entered the fray, rather than just jumping on rafts or defecting when they're fighting internationally. This smuggling boat operation is just so efficient and much safer in the sense of transporting the athletes over, but the government is trying to find a way just to resolve this really sad issue that foreign agents are going over to Cuba all the time to try and lure these people off, bribe their families, bribe their friends, to do anything to get them over, and then these athletes, of course, are beholden to those same parties once they arrive, and it's quite a dangerous passage also for them.
Yeah. You know, well, just as I said again, we're going to get to Guillermo, but a couple of fighters, for instance, just before we get on to that, I was wanting to ask you about was Erislandy Solis. Are you disappointed as to how his professional career has panned out, considering how good an amateur he was?
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
what's been his problem, really? You know, is it just been like the lack of dedication, or is it just, you know, he's got to the American way of life now and he's more happy with it, more secure, so to speak?
Well, yeah. I mean, certainly when you look at how he fought against David Haye, I mean, this is a guy who was 200 pounds, and now when he's coming in after 2 months of training, he's around 250. That's a problem, and he actually, when he was fighting against Felix Sabon in national competitions, beat him 2 out of 3 times and still was overlooked for the 2000 Olympics on the basis of it was more of a political necessity for Sabon to have an opportunity to compete to win his 3rd medal and match Stevenson and Laszlo Pop as the only men to ever do it. But Solis was overlooked and then had to win his medal in 2004. But I just don't think most of the Cubans who've come over have never been the fighters that they were in Cuba and fighting internationally once they've turned pro. I just think you have to understand that transition. Some of these Cuban athletes literally have walked into a supermarket and fainted at the sight of how much selection is available to them, given where they've come from. So when you think about people who've never had a bank account entering, I think one of the rawest forms of capitalism that is available in our society, which is pro boxing, where these guys have no protection anywhere from anything, and trying to make their way outside of the ring, I just think is a minefield that they're walking completely blind, and most of the time they're doing it without the aid of their family or friends or really anybody that they can trust. So I think that's where Solis sort of fell victim to, just trying to acclimate to his new life and never being able to go back to his old life. It took a major toll on his boxing career, and the guy was just a brilliant prospect. So it's really disappointing to see how that unfolded, but you're seeing it with many of the other Cubans as well. I think Gamboa's career is a massive disappointment.
Yeah, I was going to ask about like Gamboa and Lara, for instance. What were your thoughts on their progress so far, and Richard Abril obviously as well?
Well, I think Gamboa, I haven't really seen as much excitement as he could generate sort of since Tyson's rise. Gamboa was just, I think, the fastest hands in boxing for the last several years. I'm not sure where he's at now. We'll see when he fights Crawford in July. But I just think he had that manner about him, where I've been to many fights here in New York, covering fights for several years, and I've just never seen a crowd as electrified by his determination to make a statement with his knockouts and just his utter contempt for his opponents was just exhilarating to watch. Now, the flip side of that is I think he's not the most approachable person. I think he's run into problems, obviously, with domestic abuse. There's now a lot of indications that he was tied into a steroid ring in South Florida. So clearly not the most stable person. And his career has stalled dramatically after the fiasco with Brandon Rios, which could have been not just an opportunity for him to really, I think, enter the big time in boxing, had he knocked out Rios or done something dramatic. But he would have earned far more money than he's ever earned as a professional as well. I believe he was to earn in the neighborhood of, I think, $1 million or $1.3 million, which for a fighter, still in the infancy of his career, I mean, that's extraordinary. And not only did he not make it and not have the fight and not have an opportunity to make the statement that I think his fans were expecting, but just destroyed his career politically by arranging two massive press conferences in Los Angeles and Florida and then just not showing up. Bob Arum said he'd never had a fighter in his entire career as a promoter do such a thing. So just a lot of self-destructiveness.
Do you think it's been a bad move from Gamboa to side up with 50 Cent, Curtis Jackson?
Yes, I do. I don't see any indication that 50 Cent has a clue what he's doing as a promoter. And I think a real weakness, I mean, in boxers in general, but certainly with Cuban boxers, is I think the tendency to be offered $1,000 up front and take it against making $1 million next week or next month. So, because these people come from such scarcity, I think they make a lot of terrible decisions, and in many cases they don't think they're accountable for those decisions. They're signing contracts with multiple promoters who come over to Cuba, and then, they think there's nothing wrong with that, or that legally one contract they don't like won't be upheld for some reason, because they just have no experience in it in Cuba, where literally their entire life is supervised and looked after by the state. So once they're free to be individuals, they have no clue what they're doing, and they have no clue of the implications of doing things like signing over, power of attorney or any of these kind of things. So I think Gamboa making that decision to leave Arum to go over to 50 Cent, politically, what kind of traction has 50 Cent demonstrated in professional boxing? I don't really see any indication that he's making progress in any way. And who knows? I guess we'll have a better idea where Gamboa stands in terms of his future prospects after this fight against Crawford. But I don't feel good about it, and I kind of see him having been on the downward slide for quite a while, both as a fighter and also just his reputation really couldn't be worse in the sport.
Yeah, it's more like I think he's 30, 31 now. I think it's more like a point of either what could have been or it's now make or break, I think, in all honesty. Brent, I'm going to hand you over to my colleague Kurt Warder, who I believe has got a couple of questions for you also. Kurt?
Yeah, hi, Brin.
Hi.
Well, I want to ask you about a guy we've seen quite a lot of, being over here, like in Britain, and that's Mike Perez. He got he finally got his big chance on HBO, and obviously, it was a great fight, but sadly ended in tragedy with Abdislamov being, seriously injured. And then in his next fight after that, he didn't look too good, and now he's got another big fight against Bryant Jennings, where I think the winner of that is going to be fighting the Stavern Wilder winner. So, I mean, how do you see his career panning out? Because he's one who we've always been impressed with, as he's come up.
I think Mike Perez is a very impressive heavyweight, a very un-Cuban style also, vicious puncher. He's very impressive to me. I think he had, maybe he still has, I should say, all the potential in the world, I think, to probably move into a dominant position with the heavyweights if the Klitschko's step down. I know Vitaly's already left, but Vladimir might be soon to follow. And Mike Perez is a very dangerous proposition, I think, for any heavyweight, simply because he fights to win. He is a devastating puncher. He's a very active heavyweight. And unlike a lot of the Cubans, he started a new family in Cork. He married an Irish woman, has 2 or 3 kids, I believe. So I think he has that stable family life that a lot of them lack. And he seems to enjoy fighting. I agree his last performance wasn't great, but I think he's a very promising fighter. And I was at his fight here in New York, and yeah, aside from the devastating consequences of that fight, I thought he put on an extraordinary performance. And had he had one to follow it, unlike what he did, I think he'd be in a great position to get a fight with one of the Klitschkos.
Another fight who's going to have a Cuban who's going to have a massive fight coming up is Erislandy Lara against Saul Canelo Alvarez. I mean, how do you see that fight going?
I think that's really in Lara's hands to win that fight or to make a statement with that fight. I saw Lara fight against Angulo, where it was a very exciting fight. He was dropped twice. I believe it was the first time he'd ever been knocked down as a professional fighter. Yeah. Canelo's a big step, lots of exposure, massive fan base. So, if Lara can turn it on and outclass him, let's say with a knockout, which I don't believe Canelo's ever been knocked down before, it puts Lara into some interesting contention for a massive fight. Would Mayweather step up for that? I'm not sure, but it's a very interesting, dangerous fight for Canelo. Now, then again, I think Lara has, when he's sort of taken his foot off the gas, been rightly criticized as willing to sort of coast to victory in that Cuban style that just seems so anathema to your average fight fan. So I think it's a fascinating fight. I would favor him against Canelo personally, but most of the writers I've spoken to don't. So maybe I'm just biased in the favor of Cuban fighters.
I think it's going to be tough for him to get a decision. I think that's the way they're looking at it as well, because Canelo, he's because of the fan base. Well, if you think of the Mayweather fight, one of the judges gave him a draw in that fight. And, I personally thought Austin Trout did a lot better against Canelo, but he wasn't given much credit at all. And I think that's why Lara should be considered, a big chance of winning this fight, because his performance against Trout was really impressive, because going in, that was looked upon as a bit as a 50-50 fight, and he just dominated Trout.
Absolutely. And his performance against Paul Williams was one of the biggest travesties I've ever seen scored. I was at that fight. It was unbelievable. I think every boxing writer I saw jumped up to scream at the referee, or rather the officials who judged it. I was amazed by that performance. That was the first time I'd seen him fight live, and to dominate a fighter as skilled as Paul Williams, and I think I scored it 11-1, maybe 10-2, and as you say, against Trout, the guy is just oozing class. It's just whether he wants it, whether the conditions are right for him to put forward his best performance and he can rise to the occasion. But boy, the opportunity is there for him to make a statement. What if he, to knock out Canelo after Mayweather's performance? I think that would really impress people on the pound for pound list and that kind of thing, just to get the attention of writers who are so dismissive of him. But you rightly point out the judges have been appalling toward him, so we'll have to see.
Brin, do you know the reason why Richard Abreu has been very, very inactive? He hasn't fought much over the last couple of years. Is there an injury problem there or anything? Do you know?
Why that was why Guillermo has not fought in recently?
Abreu, Richard Abreu.
Oh, Abreu. I just think the issue with all the Cuban fighters is they're dangerous. They're going to make their opponents look bad, and they don't bring in any fan base. Where is the ideal location for a Cuban to fight? There just isn't one. They can't pull an audience in Florida. They can't pull an audience. There's no Cuban American demographic that will pay to see them. the predominant locations where Cubans in the United States live are, New Jersey, South Florida, in Los Angeles they can't pull anybody. So it's very unlike Puerto Ricans with New York or Mexicans in California. Cubans, just from a promotional standpoint, are a nightmare. I mean, even the world champions, they just draw flies. They set records for, like Redondo fought in Atlantic City, and it pulled in the worst ratings that HBO After Dark had seen in 17 years. These are not the kind of records that you want to establish as a world champion, but it's happening with a lot of frequency. So I think all their careers really suffer from just that they excel as fighters in such a way that makes their opponents look bad, and they're expensive to put on in some cases, Gamboa or Redondo, several others. So that's just a really, really bad formula in terms of dollars and cents from a promotional standpoint.
It is quite weird that you can't draw much in Miami, for instance, because I believe there is a big Cuban base there. I mean, I remember reading about Alexis Arguello, even though he's not Cuban, he's Nicaraguan. I believe he had quite a fair support from the Cubans when he was exiled by the Sandinista government, when he was forced to relocate to America after his houses and that were seized when they came to power.
Yeah,
it's quite weird. Brin, obviously you've worked in the gyms over there. Obviously when Castro took power back in '59, beforehand Cuba, I don't think actually won a medal at any Olympics. And then when Castro came to power, I think they kind of brought in some sort of Eastern European Soviet type training. For instance, I don't know if you can maybe educate us a wee bit more on their training techniques over there.
Well, yeah, you're absolutely right. I think their mastermind trainer, Alcides Segarra, came in and brought in a professor and coaches from East Germany and also the Soviet Union, and implemented the best of those training methods as he saw it. And from there, he ran the Cuban program for the next 40 years, and just racked up in that time more medals and world championships than many of the other countries combined, many of the other major countries combined. So, I mean, I think the emphasis over there is what makes them so unpopular as professionals. They're just so slick. Their defense is impeccable. On the most basic level, when I went over there to train and sort of asked, what makes you guys so good? They said, well, the most transferable skill you can have as a boxer is being able to dance. Who dances better than we do? Who's invented more forms of dance than we have? And we're this little impoverished third world country. And it's true. They just you see babies over there who can dance better than most adults can in the United States. And it translates into boxing. The footwork is impeccable. I think most fans have a tendency to watch from the waist up when they're watching boxing, but if you watch from the waist down, how Cubans in the Olympics are just leagues above their competition, and of course they're found so young. If you're a talented athlete in any back alley in Cuba, you can bet that you'll be found by the time you're 8 or 9 years old, and you're going to get the best education that you could possibly have as a fighter, and be reared all the way up until you're entering into the national championships and junior world championships and then world championships and then the Olympics. So I just think there's such an emphasis on the science of fighting over there, and then just the discipline of the athletes, and for many of them it's their only way out of really destitute circumstances. You can really have a better life as an elite Cuban athlete. So I think they take it very seriously because there just isn't an alternative over there.
I remember just when you mentioned, for instance, they pick up the children about 8, 9 years old and stuff. I remember watching the documentary called the Boys That Fought for Cuba. I remember watching that, and I was taken aback as to how basic some of the equipment was. They had tires for punching bags. I remember one young boy. I think they were that. He had to maintain his weight. I mean, I was talking about 8 or 9 year old boy here, and they put him under a set of wooden stairs in order to try and make him sweat just to get that few extra ounces off. And one thing I never even thought about is when they shave their hair so much into the skull is because the hair collects oil and that can add extra bit of ounces of weight. I just I was like, I just couldn't believe as to the lengths that we're going to make these young kids make weight.
Yeah.
It was
no, there's just nothing spared. It's just total focus. Now, a lot of people look at it and they say this looks like child abuse, but I think if you looked at the training regimen of gymnasts in China or gymnasts in the United States for that matter, or any country where they're producing the athletic equivalent of a Mozart, what was necessary to produce that are totally extreme circumstances. And certainly in Cuba, the kids I was seeing who were 8, 9, 10 years old looked like 15, 16-year-old amateurs here in New York, going to Gleason's gym, just in terms of the technique and how composed they were, given how much experience they'd had training and sparring. It's just such an intense life that they lead, and some of the ones who are found to be the real prospects, the pressure that they're under is extraordinary.
Yeah. Going on to one fighter who I believe you've struck up a good relationship with over the years, 2-time gold medalist. There was great hype and curiosity surrounding him when he made his pro debut. Guillermo Rigondeaux. I believe you've just released a book recently called Cuban Boxer's Journey. Guillermo Rigondeaux from Castro's traitor to American champion. It just came out recently, I believe. You just let our listeners know as to where they can purchase your book, and will it be available in the UK?
It absolutely is available in the UK. On Amazon's UK equivalent, I believe it's amazon.co.uk. It's available, and I would believe at book retailers anywhere in the UK you could order it. It's exclusively an ebook, so you're going to have to find it online. But any retailer that you go visit, you'd probably be able to find it.
I've noticed it on Amazon just now. Actually, it's actually only available in the UK at the minute on Kindle edition, by the looks of it. So it's not in paperback or hardback yet. So we'll need to try and keep a wee eye on that.
That's right. It's just an ebook. The other thing is you can download an app for your phone, and which is free from Kindle, and you can read it on your phone as well. It's not a paperback. I wish this one was, but that's where it's at.
I'll certainly keep an eye on it anyway. Obviously, one of the things I've been really looking forward to, and I remember speaking to, I don't know if you know him, Paddy Cronin. He, I think he's an Irishman. He knows Gary Hyde and stuff.
I know him well.
You know him well. It was Paddy was telling me some stuff on that as well, and going on to he was telling me basically about the Split Decision, the documentary that you're making or on the cusp of releasing. One thing that was a really kind of warming story was, although a bad part of the story, was when Rigo fought Willie Casey, and I believe your camera equipment was stolen. You're down to your last $1,000, and I'll let you tell our listeners as to what happened afterwards, and what transpired after you had a chat with Rigo about what was to come next.
Well, we just before we were going to the weigh-in for that fight, a pickup truck pulled up to the team van where I was traveling with Rigo, and it happened so quickly, but they yanked a gym bag out of the back of the truck, the back of the van rather, and what they were doing was intending to steal Rigo's championship belt, and instead they stole not only all my camera equipment, a laptop, and half the footage that I'd shot while I was in Ireland for that week and a half, filming him in training camp. But it was devastating in terms of I had nowhere to go to complete the film, and I'm not a gambler, but I noticed in the midst of the recession that was really Ireland was really badly hit by it, that there was such an abundance of betting shops, and I was curious about what the odds were for that fight because Willie Casey, despite being undefeated, I didn't, his record was not that impressive in contrast to a 2-time Olympic champion. So the odds were 20-1 that Rigo could knock him out in the first round, and everybody in the training camp begged me not to do it, because Rigo is not a traditional first round destroyer. But when I knocked on Rigo's door, he just had one thing to say, which was bet your life savings on it. And after he knocked him down 3 times in the first round before the referee stopped the fight, the first thing he said when he saw me on the apron was, "Where's my cut?" And he just sort of held out his gloves. And that's all in the documentary. And actually, that was money that I used to go back to Cuba and interview his family and bring footage of him to his wife and 2 kids. And that footage is also in the documentary. So in a very literal way, he saved the film and allowed me to keep going, because without that money, I was dead in the water.
Obviously, I mean, is the documentary now complete? Is it close to being aired now? Is it going to be shown?
Yeah, it is finished. I just entered it in the Toronto Film Festival, but I'd love to enter it into some festivals in the UK and across Europe. It's just a challenge selling it off, because if you have made a film as I have that features a lot of Olympic champions, there's no worse entity to deal with than the IOC in terms of licensing their footage. They are one of the most litigious organizations in existence for licensing material. So I've got to sell it off in order to get it out and to show it to people. But I'm terribly excited to have an opportunity to do that. I'm just trying to find some places to sell it.
Well, we'll certainly keep our ears open, see if we can get anybody over here who might be interested, or maybe even point you in the right direction. Obviously, you said that you went to Cuba and spoke to his wife and his 2 children. What was it like working in Cuba doing that documentary? I believe you were under constant scrutiny by the Cuban authorities when you were working over there.
Yeah, I think in Rigo's case, that house was probably the most politically radioactive in the country. I was told that the house had 2 security cameras across the street fixed on it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And the wife and kids were certainly unnerved by having somebody from outside Cuba want to talk to them. Now, they still did, but I had arranged to have a second visit with them to talk, and they hid inside their home. They pretended that they weren't there until finally Rigo's son said, "No, my family's gone away to visit a grandmother," or something like that. But it was clear they were there. And shortly after that visit, just things got very dicey, with authorities following me and people in cars driving by pointing up at security cameras, which are all over Havana. So you just never know how close the authorities are to you. You're not permitted. The catch-22 in Cuba is that they say you're only allowed to talk to anybody to cover an important story if you go through the proper channels. But if you go through the proper channels, not only will nobody clear you to pursue the story, but then you're flagged from trying to talk to anybody. So I talked to many, many journalists who went over there to cover far less challenging material, who within 3 or 4 days were, knock at the door at 4 a.m. and an escort to the airport. I was in danger in the sense of not just talking to Stevenson or Sabone or, prominent, heroes in Cuban society, but also talking to some of the younger people. For example, I did interview the star of that film that you mentioned, Christian Martinez, who was just a young, 16 years old when I caught up with him, maybe 4 or 5 years after that film came out. But I was very curious to see where he was at, because part of what I think my book and the film try to do is use the reasons why Cuban boxers stay or go with all that money on the table as a means of looking at where Cuban society on the whole is going after Fidel. And so to catch up with that 16-year-old kid and just, see where he sees his future going, and to hear a 16-year-old boy who's a national champion already say, "I want to be better than Teofilo Stevenson." I was interested to know, what does that mean? Does that mean 4 Olympic gold medals, or does it mean leaving and trying to make the money that Redondo was making? as a professional world champion, and
Yeah.
that ambiguity is really at the heart of, I think, what fascinates me so much about this story, and really what I wanted to share, because I don't see much of that permitted in other stuff that's written about Cuba. I always find out about the writer or the filmmaker discussing the topic. I don't find much about the topic itself in terms of what I've seen going there. So I think really all I brought to the subject was my confusion, and I don't know that I resolved any of that, but I hope there's something worthwhile in that, because it's a very complicated issue, and yet I found it totally compelling. So I hope some of that's translated to the audience that I'd share it with.
What did when you spoke to Guillermo's wife? Obviously you showed us some footage of him, of his fight or his previous fight at that time. What did she say? I mean, I think that'd be the first time she'd probably seen him for God knows how long. Is it? I believe they've been apart now for so many years. I mean, I remember Guillermo coming in for a lot of criticism after the Ricardo Cordoba fight back in 2011. But I'll let you tell the listeners again. Why was it a poor performance? Because I believe there was a lot of personal strife in Rigo's life at that time. I believe also he couldn't go back to Cuba because I think his mother had died or was on the cusp of passing away.
Yeah, well, one of the fascinating things about Rigo was the first defection attempt was during the Pan Am Games in Brazil in 2007 in the summer. And after that action, his father disowned him for being disloyal to Fidel and the revolution. But his mother was very sympathetic with his reasons for leaving and very supportive. So when he succeeded in defecting in February of 2009, very shortly after, his mother died. And he had done whatever he could to try and arrange being able to go back to Cuba to visit his mother for her funeral, and was told that he'd be put in prison if he ever returned to Cuba. And at the time of the Cordoba fight, he discovered through his wife that one of his children was seriously ill. And so what his wife told me when I visited her was that he was petrified that the same thing that had happened with his mother dying in his absence would happen again with his son, and that's what really impaired his performance, was that he wanted to play it safe, simply because if he felt as if he lost, during a title opportunity, that he'd left everything he'd ever known behind, and here he was, if he lost the United States, he felt he wasn't qualified to do any kind of work. He had no means of sending money back to his family. So I think he was just trying to protect what capital he'd earned, in terms of his stature as a professional fighter, and not take any unnecessary risks. But in the end, it completely sabotaged his career until that brilliant performance against Willie Casey in Ireland redeemed him, and then he just started on this wrecking ball track on the way to Donaire.
Yeah. I mean, what's obviously he's sending money back to Cuba. I mean, I take it the authorities are allowing his wife to collect that money, or are they any way interfering, or they maybe intercepting it?
The wife said that they had secret channels to get the money back. So, no, I don't think the authorities are thrilled by it, but he, according to her and according to him, is successful in sending money back. However, I have one caveat with that I think is interesting, is that I watched all the news footage because a lot of international media went into the house to inspect what was the state of Guillermo. Was he thrown in prison, or all these outlandish things that people expected to have happened to the captain of the Cuban team after an attempted defection. But I didn't see any new items in that apartment after his world championship. That doesn't mean he's not sending money back to them, but I just mean there was no conspicuous affluence in that apartment in terms of what he was sending back. So it's always hard to say. It just seems like there are no facts in Cuba. Everything is kind of a rumor, which is just very strange. There's no way to, corroborate claims over there. But yeah, that was the state of things when I went there.
What, just going on about how Rigo did eventually manage to leave Cuba. I remember reading somewhere, I think it might have been Gary Hyde, I remember being reading an interview. I think they eventually landed in Spain, I believe, and they were quite worried if they didn't get there in time because the people who were involved were quite shady or something, and they were quite worried for Rigo's life at that point. Was am I right in saying that?
Yeah, Gary Hyde was the first person to ever sign Rigo to a contract, which is ultimately what was upheld when he got to the United States, despite the fact that he left Cuba for Mexico and then found his way to Miami on somebody else's dollar. And so Gary Hyde, the first Cuban who was ever signed in Cuba and gotten off was who we were speaking about earlier, Mike Perez, who Gary Hyde also got out. And Gary Hyde got out 4 boxers in all. Guillermo was the last and also the first one he signed. Guillermo was had the most trepidation about stepping onto a smuggler's boat of any of the fighters that Hyde signed. So, I mean, that journey, I just think it can't be overstated how traumatic it is because, you know, I don't know about you, but the idea of having an amateur record of 400 fights against the best fighters in the world leads me to believe this is a very brave individual. And without any hesitation, he said the journey in the smuggler's boat was the most frightening, traumatic event of his life.
He was committed at that point, wasn't he? There was no turning back from that because obviously, was it twice failed to get away? Then surely they would have put him in prison if it failed or.
Well, I think if money wasn't changed hands once he, you know, stepped in the smuggler's boat and shipwrecked into Mexico, where he's basically held hostage until a ransom is paid. You know, there are many Cubans there who claim to be held at gunpoint. And as it's become more and more lucrative, the people who are holding you are, you know, the worst of the worst drug cartel in Mexico who've just diversified their portfolio from drugs to include human beings. And the estimates are that 10,000 Cubans, including some of these athletes, are transported every year on these smugglers' boats to Cancun and a little island off the coast of Cancun called Isla Mujeres is the actual Cuban smuggling capital of Mexico. And yeah, it's just nightmarish stories of the conditions that they endure once they get to Mexico until this money's paid. There's either a machete or a gun pointed at them until somebody pays to set them free. I think is optimistic. They're beholden to the people who've paid for their transit, and they're being given a living wage until they can make money fighting. But what happens if they don't make that money back? They can be in debt for the rest of their lives. So there's another thing, another weight on their shoulders that they have throughout their lives in the United States. And you very rarely hear the media sympathetic to any of the conditions under which these people live their day-to-day lives, let alone the stress of being a professional fighter.
Yeah. I just wondering, Brin, do you know of what kind of security arrangements are in place for when the Cubans go abroad for like the World Championships or like the Cuban World Series of boxing team? I mean, obviously, the state's going to be very, very worried or very, very wary about their best talents, who they've reared for the best part of probably 15, 20 years. Them basically kind of just doing a runner on foreign soil and just turning up at someone's embassy looking to get political asylum, so to speak. What type of security or kind of surveillance did they put their pro boxers under? I don't know if you're aware of, how far they go with that type of thing.
I think they're very careful about it. They're very careful in terms of the indoctrination of the fighters leading up to travel. They really do want true believers, and I think potentially you could argue that the most indoctrinated Cuban citizens probably are the athletes, simply because, I think Cuban athletes amount to the most expensive human cargo on earth. I mean, there's $1 billion worth of athletic capital on Cuba today in baseball players and boxers if they step foot on any shore in the world other than where they live. And with baseball, there's 6 or 7 people who could sign $50-60 million contracts tomorrow if they arrived in the United States, and I think the boxing talent has diminished somewhat because there's not as much money in the program as there used to be, with the Soviets subsidizing them the way there was in, say, the '92 Olympic team. I think after that, the money sort of had to ebb away, as it did all across Cuban society. I mean, the Cuban economy was in free fall. The black market economy was bigger than the regular economy in Cuba, and probably still is. So they're facing their problems, but I think what the coaching staff is really there to do, not so much with the security once they are traveling internationally, because it's not as if they're under lock and key, but it's really who's selected to travel internationally is where the real security measures are taken. And the other thing is, off the record, how much are those families going to pay if somebody steps away from the team when they're traveling internationally? There are no limits to how vindictive the government can be against the family's economic opportunities, or tightening the vice in terms of money that's sent home. You can't buy anything in Cuba unless you really have permission to do so. You can't, even if I send $1 million to a friend in Cuba, they can't buy a car, they can't buy a house, they can't do anything with that money in any significant way to improve their lives without permission, without risk of, a policeman knocking on their door. So that, I think that's where the security is these guys know back in Cuba, just every element of their lives is circumscribed by the state. So if you attempt to thumb your nose at the state, not just you, but everybody can be drastically affected. Their lives can be drastically affected for the worse.
I mean, I take it there's no suggestion that the Cuban state's going to be kind of a wee bit more relaxed and stuff. I mean, if you go back to I think just before the revolution, you had the great fighters like Kid Gavlan and Kid Chocolate, obviously Benny Kid Perez as well. I take it there's absolutely no possibility in the near future about them allowing them to be professional fighters, let them go abroad, but as long as they're under, strict scrutiny by the state, that they definitely come back to the island. I think there's no possibility of that ever happening anytime soon.
Well, I think the other issue is that the embargo doesn't permit that to happen. It's like if you travel to Cuba as an American, there's nothing prohibiting Americans traveling to Cuba. By Cuban law, it's American law that forbids you to go there. One of the great ironies is that now Cuba, you're allowed to sell real estate, you're allowed to sell cars now, and there's an incredible amount of foreign investment in hotels and resorts, and the only country that's not permitted to do so is the United States. And it's not by Cuban law that they aren't, it's by American law that they're forbidden to engage in free enterprise in Cuba with investment. So it's one of the funny ironies that exists there. That I mean, you could make a strong argument that South Florida has delivered 2 elections to George Bush, and the only thing that voting populace really cares about is the attitude towards not the only thing, but a significant thing that voting populace cares about is that embargo being tightened even further than it is. For that reason, the embargo would have to be dropped for any of those Cubans to be able to make any kind of money in the United States, and then from the Cuban side, it would just be a question of how much money does the state get. Now, I think that's a lot more probable on the Cuban side, it being permitted, because they already do permit it with musicians and artists. Probably the most lucrative profession you could have in Cuba is to be an artist. Ironic coming, as I talk to you from the United States, where it's probably the worst profession to be in, to paint or something in terms of how much money you'd expect to make. But Cuban painters and musicians, if they have any international recognition or success, live better than anybody else that I've seen, because for the simple reason that they can keep more money than any other profession that's gotten internationally. So I could see it. I think in the foreseeable future, some kind of compromise there could happen. Now, obviously, they couldn't fight in the United States, but maybe there'd be more availability in them fighting internationally and being able to keep 10 or 20% of what their earnings are, which still by Cuban standards would be a fortune. So, as I say, there's a precedent for it with the arts. I don't know that it would be that massive a leap to see it with athletics.
Brin, do you know, or I suppose you will know, but can you let us know, are you in any way blacklisted or banned from going into Cuba? Because, you know, obviously you've been speaking with people who are under scrutiny from the state. Are you able to come and go as you please, or are you kind of effectively banned from the country now?
I think I just put up a video today, which is the first time I've ever shown my interview with Teofilo Stevenson, where he's on camera asking for money. You see him on camera drinking and smoking, and saying that he's broke. But I had a conversation with the Miami Herald shortly after Stevenson died, where they on their front page discussed that interview. So I'm pretty sure I can't go back. And the other feature that was just a really dumb decision on my part was having a bit of a fling with Fidel Castro's granddaughter that I don't think helped matters in returning to Cuba. But yeah, I'd assume I can't. But I haven't rolled the dice and tried. But from what I've been told, I went quite a bit further than other journalists in terms of, you know, I think it's one thing to have a print interview with Stevenson with what happened, but to actually see it, as I say, that short film just came out today. It's called The Greatest
YouTube?
Fight That Never Was. It's not on YouTube. It's on a website called SB Nation, and
SB Nation.
SB Nation.
SB Nation.
And it's accompanying an article called Heroes for Sale, looking at Teofilo Stevenson and the latest Cuban superstar defector, Yasiel Puig, who plays for the Los Angeles Dodgers. And that film is really looking at the consequences of the great fight that never was between Ali and Stevenson.
All right, I'm just looking for it just now, so I'll have a read at that. And it's there's a picture of him here sitting here with his cigarette, and he's got a pair of blue trousers on. Brin, I'm really grateful for your time. I've had you on now for just over an hour. Just before I let you go, can you let our listeners know, is there any upcoming Cuban fighters on the island through the amateur ranks that we should maybe keep an eye on for future World Championships, Olympics, etc., or anybody who we know or you may know has maybe smuggled themselves into America and maybe coming up through the ranks through in the States?
Well, I think it would be drastically inappropriate to mention any names that would likely be coming to the United States that I've heard of, because some really unfortunate things could befall not just them but their family to disclose those names. I will say, I think the hero of that documentary you mentioned, Christian Martinez, was a superb talent. In the years since that documentary came out, he's progressed exceedingly well. And some of the others, I mean, we talked about Sabone's nephew, I think has the potential. I mean, he's still such a young kid. A lot of promise there. But I haven't seen that next Sabone, that next successor. I mean, that's what I tried to do with both the book and the documentary, was find that continuum of the most elite of the boxers. And I kind of viewed it as this sort of relay race of Stevenson handing the baton to Sabone, who handed it over to Rigondeaux. And what I was trying to look at as a kind of conclusion is who does the baton go to next? And what I think I concluded is the baton goes to the Cuban, as you're suggesting, who comes to the United States before he's had the long, illustrious amateur career. Because I just see that as the trend, that as the way things are now, it's very difficult to imagine those Cuban youth not wanting to pit themselves against the best of the best by turning professional, either like Perez going to Europe or coming to South Florida. So, yeah.
Very interesting, very interesting. Brendan, I'm going to read this article. It's very, very lengthy, so it's going to take me a wee bit of time to go through it. Just before I let you go, can we just get you to kind of read out, for instance, where we can get your book about your documentary and where people can hit you up on social media to discuss anything, all things Cuban boxing?
Absolutely. The book is called A Cuban Boxer's Journey, and it's available where any books are sold from retailers around the world. Amazon, Barnes and Noble, etc. I'm on Twitter under Brinicio. I was new to social media, so I chose a very bad handle, unfortunately, but I'm going to have to live with it. The documentary is called Split Decision, and as I mentioned, I'm hoping to enter it into a number of festivals and get it sold and get it out to the public as soon as I can. I'd love for them to see what was a real journey for me over 4 years to get the film made. I never imagined meeting Rigondeaux in 2007, shortly after the failed defection, that 5 years later the guy would put on a performance like he did against Donaire in Radio City Music Hall. It was extraordinary to see, and trying to sort of put together how he got there based on the Cuban system was the backstory that just fascinated me. So yeah, I think that's about it.
Yeah, Brian, I've got to really thank you for this, mate. I mean, it's been a real education for me to understand a wee bit more about a world that's, in all honesty, it's kind of closed to me. I mean, obviously, I live in Scotland, so I don't really get a chance to understand a wee bit more about the political situation in Cuba. I can only go by what I read on the internet and watch fights, etc. But this has been a real education for me, and I'd like to thank you because our listeners will get a real treat from this on the show on Sunday. So I've got to thank you for your time, mate.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'd love to get this story out to there's a lot of people who care about it, so it's a real pleasure to be able to reach as many as I can with it.
Yep. Anyway, mate, I'll let you go at this time, but very, very much appreciated for your time. Thanks very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Cheers, mate. Thanks.
Bye-bye.